Hello, my name is Robert K. Elder, and I am the editor of Hemingway in Comics, which chronicles the 120 plus times over 18 countries that Ernest Hemingway shows up in comic books.
So why Hemingway? Where did that interest come from?
I live in Oak Park, Illinois, which is Hemingway's hometown, and I had done a previous book called Hidden Hemingway about his archives. And I love comics, and I had sort of, as a way of promoting Hidden Hemingway, I was writing for the Comics Journal about, again, this weird little thing where he shows up in comics. And as people who know comics already know, cameos are not a new thing. You know, Barack Obama shows up in Spider-Man, so does Stephen Colbert, Eminem, the cast of Saturday Night Live, Orson Welles showed up in a Superman comic book. And so this was just a little weird obsession where my two worlds collided. So comics and Hemingway.
So having been represented, a real person, having been represented mostly in cameo form,
Sure,
through so many different interpretations, I'm assuming based on your previous work that you know a lot about what Hemingway was really like.
Too much, yeah, too much. Yeah.
So what's sort of the range of the ways in which he's represented?
So it goes from absolute reverence to complete irreverence. So they either love him and sort of, you know, plumb the inner artist and his difficulties and his contradictions, or he is a Hunter S. Thompson-like gonzo character. And, you know, there are a lot of great books that do this. The Life After does that really, really well. But again, he shows up in, you know, Italian Mickey Mouse cartoons or comics. He shows up in The Creeper, in Shade the Changing Man. So it's a really, really long list.
Is there a sort of middle ground or a version that you think is the most faithful to who your understanding of him as a person was?
No. No, I mean, there's some really interesting takes. Peter Milligan's take on Hemingway in Shade the Changing Man is really brilliant. I really like that two-issue arc he did with Colleen Doran. But there's so much good stuff out there. I can't recommend it enough.
So every time there is a sort of fictionalized, very storytelling-based version of a true story put out there, whether I remember this argument from Social Network and Argo, and somebody really takes license with it.
Sure.
There's always arguments about sort of the morality of really playing with a real person's life. How do you feel about that and how it affects Hemingway?
Well, it is really interesting. I just came from the International Hemingway Conference in Wyoming, and somebody said, well, what do you think Hemingway would have thought about this? I'm like, he would have been mad, you know, because in a sense you're losing control of your legacy, and Hemingway really wanted control of his legacy. You know, he even said, burn all my letters. And they didn't, thank goodness, because I think there's 17 plus volumes, you know, coming out of his letters. We would just know less about him. But it's what happens when you become a pop culture icon. When your work outlives you, when your image outlives you, it's part of what we do as not just Americans, but it happens the world over. So, you know, my Elvis is not your Elvis. I'm trying to think of other, you know, sort of like crossover Big Bang sort of people. My Public Enemy is not your Public Enemy. You know, they belong to the culture at a certain point.
So can you tell us a little bit about the process of getting the book together and getting it out there?
Sure, sure. I mean, I started writing these little articles. They're just meant to be like promote my first book, Hidden Hemingway. So I wrote, you know, one piece for the Comics Journal, and that turned into 3 pieces, and then people would write in. And then I started doing something about, you know, these Italian Disney comics that have never been translated, and so I wrote that for the Hemingway Society website. And it just snowballed, and my editor said, like, you know, you should put a book of this together. And I said, no, I just don't have time. He's like, well, if you don't do it, somebody else is just going to take your research and do it. I said, fine, as long as I don't have to spend more than 3 months doing it. And it's been 5 years.
Oh my gosh.
And the great thing about it is this, so there's an exhibit that goes along with it. It'll be at San Diego Comic-Con Museum in Balboa Park, and it'll be there through the end of the year. And then it goes on tour for 5 years with Exhibits USA, and that's actually still being booked right now. So it's sort of gotten too big for me. It's been this really interesting, amazing thing, but I never expected it to go beyond the first article I wrote.
So how did you find all of these iterations? Like, you'd have to sort of scour the entirety of comics history.
Yes, yeah, I did. You know, there were some people and some indexing sites that really helped the comic book database. Some things were mislabeled. Also, just recommendations from people. So I actually got a new one a couple days ago. Hemingway shows up in a couple pages of The Lincoln Brigade, which is the Spanish comic book, and it now has a American or an English language version from Caliber Comics. So people just send them to me at this point. But it's a lot of fun discovering all this stuff.
So one of the memorable pull quotes I saw about your book is about how Hemingway would have felt about being in comic books. How do you think that someone from his sort of literary point of view would feel about the comic book industry?
I don't think he would have any reference. I just found out, again, at the International Hemingway Conference, a scholar, Verna Kale, hello Verna, came up and said, actually, we know Hemingway did read comics, and he makes reference to it in this letter, I think in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So I know he read comics, but I don't think he knew anything about it. He certainly knew more about baseball and boxing than he did about comics.
So what's next for you? Do you have your next project sort of in the works at all?
Yeah, I mean, so at this point I have written 16 books.
Oh God.
And that's not including the little mini projects I do for Running Press. I write, little character histories for Marvel Comics and Running Press. They just asked me to do their Hulk volume. So I've done Black Panther, Captain Marvel, Thor, and so Hulk will be coming out next year. I also wrote a history of the Doomsday Clock, which is, the clock that sort of keeps track of how close we are to self-destruction from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. So that is out right now in hardcover. And I'm just trying to make it through the next few months, actually. But yeah, there's always something going.
If you were to put together a book like this for another historical figure, who is sort of intriguing to you?
Well, Hemingway has more appearances, just slightly more than Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln in comics might be really interesting. But I think actually a larger book about all the cameos, because there are some crazy cameos, might be a lot of fun. I'm just not sure it's commercially viable.
So tell us where to find the book and all the rest of your work, as well as you on social media.
Yeah, so I'm at Robert K. Elder on Twitter. You can also find Hemingway in Comics at hemingwayincomics.com, and you can find all of my books at my website, robertkelder.com.